Professor Hamilton is currently Director of Aesthetics, Ethics, and Politics at Durham, and he did his PhD, supervised by Crispin Wright, on the topic of the self and self-consciousness. So his current areas of study are philosophy of mind, history of 19th and 20th century philosophy, and Wittgenstein, but he's now working more in aesthetics and political philosophy, as I understand it. He wrote a monograph entitled Aesthetics in Music, and also a book on improvisation called The Art of the Improviser, with jazz saxophonist Lee Konitz. And Professor Hamilton is a jazz pianist himself and writes for The Wire and other contemporary music magazines on jazz, contemporary composition, and improvised music. So today's talk is entitled The Canon and the Test of Time. So without further ado, I'll give it away. I will say that our talks last 45 minutes, and then we give 15 minutes of Q&A at the end, and also the talk is being recorded. So, Professor Hamilton.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me here to my alma mater. Really exactly alma mater.
This is mostly society, not classes.
Well, mater means mother, and I forget that. As well as a student. So I just want to tell you that philosophy society, what St Anne's used to be like sometime in the 19th century, which is astonishing. But there weren't any coffee shops when I was here. Incredible. There weren't any coffee shops. A few other strange things. Anyway, so I'm going to do an unusual topic here because you've probably heard of the Canon, and you've probably heard of debate about the status of the Canon. The test of time is really neglected. Nobody writes about that. And I'm extending it to call it the test of time and place. And they're connected, actually. So, and it's best known as an area of discussion in aesthetics, but actually it applies across all areas of human life. So first of all, I think that's the first thing to say. It applies across, the test of time applies to all areas of human life, and it should be called the test of time and place because what it says is that artworks of quality, or the best artworks, are those with broad and enduring appeal across all cultures, which could be in time and place. So it's not just across cultures, in the past. It's applying to, a range of cultures, Western cultures, South Asian cultures, East Asian cultures. Something that appeals broadly in that way is good for some reasons that we're going to explore. Now, Anthony Savile wrote a book called The Test of Time. That's about the only book that's written on it, actually, which was, I think, in the 1970s or something. And he said the function of time is to allow the better view to emerge. I mean, look, this is very important, actually, because it's been said that we live in an amnesiac society. That means a society that forgets about the past. And I suppose you could say traditional societies are the reverse. They can't forget the past. We forget the past. And I just mentioned an example of that seems to be decolonisation and removal of offensive statues. You've really got to know about the historical context, and it strikes me that so many people who advocate that kind of view, which may be the right view, nonetheless are rather amnesiac, or they're not sufficiently interested in the past. And maybe philosophy students are included in that, because I've noticed the history of philosophy is not the most popular part of philosophy. And it ought to be. You can't do philosophy without doing the history of philosophy. So the test of time arises with the artistic canon. By the way, I'm not going to, I will take 45 minutes, so if I can't get through all this in 45 minutes, I will remove bits of it. Okay? So the test of time arises with the artistic which is also the advent of the artwork. Now, here's another thing you might not realise, and I used to not realise that what happened in the 19th century, early 19th century, was that Bach's work, the works of J.S. Bach, particularly the Samaki Passion, were revived by Mendelssohn, who was himself a composer, but he was also a conductor, and he would perform Bach. And I used to think, well, that's very interesting. I mean, I was very struck by the fact, you know, Bach had disappeared from the canon. You know, he was performed in his lifetime, and then he died in 1750, and then it took till the 1820s or 30s or whenever it was, when Mendelssohn revived Bach, so Bach re-entered the canon. But actually that's wrong. There was no canon. Right? So there was no tradition of performing old works. Classical music is a 19th century invention. And that is assumed nowadays that, you know, serious music is music of the past. On the whole, you know, people try and write new music, and some of it enters the canon, but on the whole, it's the classics, you know, Bach, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, etc. You know, we're kind of familiar with the idea that, if you want to call it serious music, it's not quite the right word, but you know, concert music is music of the past. Well, until 1800, well, there weren't any concerts, but music was performed. The music that was performed was the music of the present day. Music of the past was not performed, on the whole. I mean, in the West anyway. I mean, there are probably different things to say about other cultures. So, in music, the canon is quite a recent thing, but in other art forms it's not. That's not the same. You know, I mean, Homer entered the canon. There's been a canon of literature going back to ancient Greece. So music seems to be a bit different. Sorry about that. But there are really two senses of canon. So I'm going to talk about the canon a bit now, and so I think that is. And the canon originally referred to the books of the prophets accepted by the Christian church as genuine, and that's constituting the Bible. Right? So the canon, the original sense of the canon was the books of the prophets that are to be included in the Bible. And why do you need to have a Bible? Because Christ disappeared, died, crucified, and then you didn't see him come back. Well, I mean, he was risen and then he disappeared again, and you know, they were hanging around waiting for the kingdom of God in the decay. So we had to we had to preserve authentic belief through a book. And that the genetic concept of the canon appeared with the Council of Nicaea in 325 Common Era, when the books of the Bible considered authentic were selected. So the first canon, the first use of that term, is in connection with the Bible and the Christian religion. But there's a genetic criterion for the canon in that sense. Genetic meaning how it originated, how the item originated. We're talking about a scriptural canon that makes up the Bible, and a book belongs in it if it's divinely inspired. Now that's obviously got nothing to do with how books enter the artistic canon. So if we're talking about the canon of English literature or the canon of classical music, that's got nothing to do with religious inspiration, and it's to do with exemplifying an artistic ideal or having a certain artistic quality. Now, so we can already see that there's no such thing as the canon. There are different senses of canon, and there are different canons actually. And they apply to English literature, music, painting, drama, jazz, philosophy, rock and roll, detective novels, television series perhaps. And each of these areas has canons in a different sense. It has a disciplinary canon, a repertorial canon, a critical canon. So the first of those is to do with education, the second is to do with performance, and the third is to do with what critics discuss, although obviously they're all connected. So that's the definition of canon and test of time. And in terms about different approaches to the arts and to the canon. And there's a conflict between what you would call aestheticism and what I call ideological critique or postmodernism. So if somebody says something like, the canon is, they might say, which they often do say, the canon is patriarchal, ethnocentric and elitist, and indeed racist and colonialist and whatever. Well, that's the mark of somebody who's expressing an ideological critique. That is, they assume an ideology and they're saying, in the light of that, there's something wrong with this collection of works, or indeed with the very idea of collecting. Now, there's a distinction there. You could certainly say there's something wrong with the canon of English literature because it doesn't have enough women in it, it doesn't have enough non-British people or non-white people and so on. That could be criticism of the way it's composed, or it's something to do with the very idea of the canon. Now, I think the second criticism is mistaken, misguided. The first criticism obviously has been true, may still be true. Now, a well-known proponent of the first view of the arts is a critic called Harold Bloom, who wrote a book called, there's two Blooms actually, there's also Leopold Bloom, except for one, but I will forget what the second one is now, Harold Bloom. Anyway, very confusing to have two characters in related areas. Bloom. So Harold Bloom wrote the Western canon. He defended it, so he's a defender of the canon, on the basis of what he calls the autonomy of the aesthetic. And he says we must choose either, we're art lovers, or we're people who are concerned with race, class and gender. Bloom attacked what he called the school of resentment. Feminists, Afrocentrists, Marxists, Foucault-inspired new historicists, deconstructors. They're not really interested in literature. They only want to advance their programs for social change. And he says the quality of a poem, novel, or play must be judged in its own terms, independent of social or political concerns. So Toni Morrison's novel, Song of Solomon, should be judged in literary terms. Its origins in African American experience are irrelevant to its critical evaluation. Now there's something to that. I don't reject that entirely. But I want to develop a middle way because I'm very inspired by the great Tony Blair, the genius of that generation, much maligned these days, unfairly. Such that if I'm as a member of the Labour Party, I could never stand up in a Labour meeting and say that. Shout it down. But, so the middle way. In philosophy, actually, it's very common to be trying to get the middle way. Because the middle way is usually the correct way. And we're trying to get, because, common positions like aestheticism and ideological critique are unlikely to be completely wrong. So we want to find out what's the truth in them. And we end up with somewhere in between, and a way in between, which is, I think, arguing here. I mean, one thing I'd say, for example, is that art for art's sake is a worthy aspiration, but it's not incompatible with political and ideological content. So you can have a political novel that is valuable as art for its own sake. There are many cases of political novels. I mean, one of them I recommend is one of the greatest political novels, is by Conrad, called Under Western Eyes, which I strongly recommend. Who's read Under Western Eyes, actually? Good, okay. Well, who's read Heart of Darkness? Yeah, okay, so people have read that one. Well, I would say Under Western Eyes is a greater novel than Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is a very interesting piece of work. So, Under Western Eyes tells you something about the nature of terrorism and why it's wrong, or what exactly is wrong with it. And it's a political novel. It has political content, but it's valuable as art for its own sake. It's valuable. It's not just valuable because you learn something about politics. And actually, when you're thinking about this is maybe two of the most valuable art is art that also tells you something about politics or human life, or, you know. Anyway, that's a kind of, well, it's not a side issue, it's a fundamental issue, but that's not my main topic here. So all these concepts are connected. The concept of the canon, the artwork, criticism, art for art's sake, ideological content. Well, I've already said that. Talk about the canon, singulars and sleeping. Okay. Oh, just repeating myself there. Sorry about that. Right. Entering or leaving the canon. Now, I think it takes a while after the death of a writer or composer for their work to enter the canon. I don't think this happens for some time, some decades. And many artists who are popular in their lifetime, I mean, this is a very fascinating fact. And by the way, this is something also philosophy neglects. It's so important. Reception history. How was Hume's treatise regarded throughout its history? That's a really important fact. And how was it interpreted? And how did it change? How did interpretation change? Philosophers are remarkably uninterested in that. Even the ones who are interested in history of philosophy don't seem to be that interested. It's really fundamental. And in other art forms, or in art forms, people are interested in this. And they spend a lot of time, perhaps too much time, researching concert programs of the early 20th century because they want to know what music was performed. And that's very interesting. And early 20th century British concerts featured Elgar, Holst and Vaughan Williams, whose work is still performed. But also forgotten luminaries like Sir Alexander Mackenzie, Buckland Boughton and Joseph Holden. They were very popular in their lifetime. I'm going to say a bit more about this actually later. And here's I love this quote actually. Three novelists, apparently, dominated Victorian literature in the mid-19th century. Charles Dickens, William Makepeace Thackeray, and Douglas Jerrold. Of course, everyone knows Douglas Jerrold, don't they? Critic David Masson wrote in 1851, when viewed in the general as humorous and men of inventive talent, the three do form a triad, so it's hardly possible to distinguish the merits of any one of them without referring to the other two. Well, actually, we find it very easy to refer to Dickens and Thackeray without referring to Jerrold at all. Now, it's wrong to say that Jerrold disappeared from the canon. He never entered it. He may yet enter it. It's not very likely. I've never read any Jerrold. Maybe it's good. It's quite possible it's very good. But it's not quite possible. It's possible. But he hasn't entered the canon. So it's unlikely. Now, Sir William Hamilton, my great namesake, in his day, he was the philosophical equal of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill wrote an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy. And then I was fortunate to be able to write an examination of Mill's examination of Hamilton. But anyway, he disappeared from the, well, he didn't ever enter the canon. Right? He never entered the, he was a huge, you know, if you'd asked a Victorian knowledgeable person, who's the greatest philosopher of our age, you'd have said, Sir William Hamilton, of course, you know, who else? And John Stuart Mill went along with that because, you know, nowadays Mill is the most important philosopher of that time. But he had a look at Hamilton's philosophy. But Hamilton never entered the canon. So it wasn't that he was in the canon and he disappeared, he just never entered it. And Dr. Johnson famously apparently said that Lawrence Sterne did not last. But actually, Sterne hadn't started when Johnson wrote that, so it wasn't that he didn't last. He hadn't started. So, entering and leaving the canon, there's a certain amount of misunderstanding about this, because it takes a long time to get into the canon. actually, there are some cases of great artists entering the canon. Well, the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor, one of the greatest British architects, he never entered the canon until the 1960s, such that some of his greatest buildings were being demolished. It was very close. It was very, it was nearly the case that some of Hawksmoor's great churches in the city of London were demolished. But fortunately, people began to appreciate him. But, he died in 1750 or something. Or something around that, so we're talking about somebody over 200 years took him to enter the canon. So it's not, Right, so let me say a bit more about postmodern ideological critique. For postmodern critics, standards of artistic value are rationalizations of cultural power, a means whereby the dominant social order perpetuates its own ideology. The canon is an instrument of oppression, hence the salience of postmodernism is the question, who decides what is in the canon? So I'm standing here advocating the canon, and I'm mentioning various names, like Dickens or Hume or whatever. But what I'm doing really is asserting my cultural power. I'm a representative of, I don't feel like a representative of dominant social power at all. I'm like a totally downtrodden, pathetic liberal. Apparently I'm, oppressing people by making these claims. Now, this is obviously a possibility that there are people who enjoy going around showing off their knowledge and putting people down. That's obviously possible. But that's not the only, someone who's an educator, someone who's a teacher, or works in an education institution, presumably they're meant to enthuse people with the things they think are valuable, which doesn't seem to me to be oppressing them. But the postmodern view is that that's the basis of what's going on. Is that you've got these works in the canon, and they're constantly being adapted on television or performed in concerts or something. But what is really going on is that they are manifestations of the dominant cultural power and their consent to oppress the non-dominant powers that are not dominant. And Barbara Bernstein-Smith is a representative. People have said, come on, Hamilton, who are let's have some names here. It's true that I need to do more work on picking out some names of these postmodernists who are putting forward this view. But one of them seems to be Barbara Bernstein-Smith. Mind you, that's a fairly old name, because she wrote a book in the 1980s that I'm referring to. So I'll probably look to be better than this. As long as I don't like reading it, it's so repellent. So Barbara Bernstein-Smith, quite hard to read, really, states as something obvious that classic literature is irrelevant to those lacking in orthodox Western education. Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare do not figure significantly in the personal economies of these people, those who lack orthodox Western education, do not perform individual or social functions that gratify their interests, do not have value for them. So all these great names from the canon of English literature, we can't expect them to have appeal beyond, we can feed them. The bourgeois Western liberal can feed them to people who are, from other cultures, but they're not really going to appeal. They don't come from their culture. This is something I just totally don't believe. But it's Philistine, right? Actually, that's a word I haven't used. But Philistine is a word meaning someone who doesn't appreciate art. And that's the situation we have here. So those who should be, it's called the Trahison d'éclair, which appears at the top of section 5. Treachery, betrayal by the intelligentsia, right? So Smith says, other literature performs for these people the functions that the classic writers perform for recipients of a good bourgeois education. So what we have now is a situation, now this doesn't happen so much in philosophy, but it may happen in other subjects. But obviously I should be careful, I should do my research more carefully. Because I don't want to say that all over the humanities there are these people trashing the classics. But there is a feeling that there's something wrong with the classics. So as Lichtenberg predicted, today we are trying to spread knowledge everywhere. He was writing in the, I can't remember, 17th or 18th centuries. Lichtenberg predicted, today we are trying to spread knowledge everywhere. Who knows if in centuries to come there will not be universities for re-establishing our former ignorance. Great quote. No, I mean, are they? Look, this is, no, obviously they're not. Obviously this is an exaggeration, but there is a danger. Now, let me say a bit more about what ideological critique says about. I mean, obviously this is a Marxist inspiration. I'm not anti-Marxist. There's a lot of truth in what Marx said. But if you're asking what is where it comes from Marx's notion of ideology, this notion of ideological critique. And I think it's not completely wrong at all, but there's something wrong with it. And there's a wrong picture about how the canon works and how ideology affects the canon. So the picture is that each society has a dominant ideology, and we have a bourgeois capitalist ideology in this society, and I don't particularly disagree with that. But that bourgeois capitalist ideology feeds into the canon and makes sure that the artworks that we study, the artworks that are positively valued, are the ones that reinforce that ideology. That's what ideological critique says. Now, and there's some truth in that, but not enough truth. So actually, when I think about it, there's something wrong with the Marxist notion here. It's just not true that this is the case. If you look at the classics of English literature, they're not uncritical of capitalism. I mean, Dickens' Hard Times. Marx really didn't like contempt for Dickens because he had no program for bringing about the revolution. But Dickens has been more influential in, I think, or at least as influential in social improvement as Marx in Victorian Britain. So, ideological critique says that works supporting the dominant ideology are more likely to be admitted to the canon. So the canon, who decides what's in the canon? That's the question that postmodernists are always asking. Who decides? Don't imagine that it's the quality of the work that decides. It's someone's interest that decides what goes into the canon. And now this is certainly true of totalitarian canons. The Nazi canon rejected degenerate art and appropriated Wagner and Bruckner, so it appropriated these composers for its ends. In the 19th century, Shakespeare was exported to India as part of the English civilizing mission. But even under a regime as oppressive as Stalin's, elites cannot make a work canonical. The public have to like what is selected. You can't make people like something that doesn't appeal. So the Russian people loved Tchaikovsky. But after the 1917 revolution, his music was condemned by the official press as alien to the proletarian consciousness. It was bourgeois music, okay? But the composer continued to be popular. Finally, in 1940, the regime had to relent and it became a standard bearer of progress. So, you can't make people like things that don't have quality or don't appeal to them. So, is the canon reactionary or conservative? No, it doesn't have to be. It usually is not. It's neither revolutionary nor reactionary. Now, if rock and roll appears in a canon, as increasingly it does, or in a canon, that may tame it. You can tame punk by creating a punk canon. But the test of time is anti-conservative in discouraging a leap to judgment. If people hear something avant-garde, mostly they won't like it. But the test of time says, wait and see. So here's some examples from a book by Jonathan Rose that I recommend. The intellectual life of the English working classes. Or was it the English working class? Can't remember. So think about what Barbara Bernstein-Smith says about dominant culture, defining the value of high culture, and if you haven't had an orthodox Western education, then you're not going to like the classics of English literature because they're for people who have an orthodox Western education. The Labour MP Will Crooks grew up in extreme poverty in East London, and when he was young, he spent 2 odd pence, on a second-hand copy of the Iliad, and this is what he said. What a revelation it was to me. Pictures of romance and beauty opened up before my eyes. I was transported from the East End to an enchanted land. It was a rare luxury for a working lad like me just home from work to find myself suddenly among the heroes and nymphs of ancient Greece. Now, in Barbara Bernstein-Smith's account, this is not Crook's own literature, and he shouldn't be enjoying it, but he did, because it's a classic. And that's what happens with classics. Lots of people enjoy it. They have no connection with the culture that helped create it. So Rose's book shows poignantly that cultural deprivation is real because he was culturally deprived and he knew that, he felt that. As Rose writes, when autodidacts were asked which books made all the difference to them, they usually pointed to the same canon derided by contemporary critics such as Smith. If the classics offered artistic excellence, psychological insights, and penetrating philosophy to the governing classes, then the politics of equality must begin by redistributing this knowledge to the governed classes. So, one of my themes is that it's the populists who are the elitists. Those who claim to be populists, they're the real elitists. They don't recognise there's such a thing as cultural deprivation. They want to deprive people who would benefit and enjoy the classics, they want to deprive them of that benefit. And that's the true elitism. Okay, well, 10 minutes. Now here's an interesting fact or phenomenon. What I call this the self-perpetuation phenomenon. Right, so this is the idea that there's something wrong, according to postmodernists, there's something wrong with what's going on here, that a great book tends to shape and create the culture in which its value is produced, and so perpetuate the conditions of its own flourishing, and that's obviously bad, isn't it? Well, no, because every cultural practice needs self-perpetuation. That's the wrong word. It needs something that stands the criterion of value. And David Hume recognised this in his essay on the standard of taste. Some great works themselves constitute a standard or test of time. Shakespeare's plays have become part of the bedrock in terms of which other potentially canonical works are assessed by the end of the 18th century, not before then. It's hard to conceive of a canon of Western drama that excluded Shakespeare. I mean, you know, someone says, tastes vary, I don't like opera. That's okay, you can understand that. But if someone says, tastes vary, I don't like art. There's something. Tastes vary, I don't like Shakespeare. You know, I love drama, but I just can't get on with Shakespeare. There's something that's peculiar. Because Shakespeare sets criteria for what the English language, maybe any language, can do. His work expresses everything that language can express. So if you don't like that, you don't like imaginative literature or drama. And actually, this is what Wittgenstein noticed on certainty, when he argued that an empirical discovery could, over time, gain a special logical role in scientific investigation as a hinge on which in particular empirical judgments turn. So it's often he's ridiculed for his comments on, humans could never go to the moon, because not too long after he died, they did go to the moon. And people say, how ridiculous, no, that's an obviously his views are crazy because after he died, people did go to the moon. But this is precisely an example of what he's talking about. Because people can't go to the moon was a bedrock certainty until about the Second World War, when rockets began to be developed, and then some people thought, well, maybe we might even get to the moon on this, you know. So it became empirically false. From being a bedrock certainty, it became empirically false. Then in 1969, it became empirically true, and now it's a bedrock certainty that people can get to the moon. So these things change. So they're not, you know, but the idea that it might, you know, if you say, well, you know, I don't think you want to make too much of Shakespeare because, you know, in a few hundred years, God knows, I mean, you know, maybe Shakespeare will be out of the canon. Well, it won't be a canon of drama in any sense in which we can understand, if that's the case. Now, I'm just going to talk about a couple of other objections to the test of time canon. Remember that I said I don't object to the idea that the canon has the wrong things in it. There may be something wrong with what makes up the canon, but that you need a canon, or that there will be a canon. Canon is necessary, and that's one reason why it's necessary, actually. Right, so think about contemporary classic. You might have heard that term. This is a contemporary classic, an instant classic, you know. And some people think, well, maybe some things are so obviously great that you can tell straight away. I don't think this is true. So Beethoven's patron, Count Waldstein, wrote to him when he was 21, and he said, I think he was going to be off to have lessons with Haydn. And he said, you're going to receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. So posterity apparently has little say in this. Beethoven was exemplary and popular in his own lifetime and has remained so uninterruptedly ever since. So you might say, well, you know, Beethoven was an instant classic. But actually Cherubini was very popular too. There's always other people around at that time who were equally popular, and then something's gone wrong. Or Dickens, Thackeray and Gerald, right? So Gerald, or Mill and Sir William Hamilton, you know, so they haven't all survived. Now actually works that appeal strongly to the mood of a generation. Somerset Maugham, for instance, in the 1920s and 30s, quickly become dated. And a figure that appeals strongly to a particular generation may often not have a critical attitude towards the attitudes of their time. Dated means of its time, but without the imagination to take a larger view, not realising that things could be different from how they are. And so a lazy film or documentary maker uses pop music of the time to locate their action. Pop music is not just a symptom of its time, it helps to create it. So, it's not an objection to the test of time that there are instant classics. It's very doubtful that there are instant classics. So I'm trying to sort of argue that it takes a long time for things to enter the canon, even things that are popular. And the thing about popularity in its time, so, you know, there's this thing called popular music. Well, there's a reason to think that the most popular music is classical music, because over time, that's had the biggest appeal. And at a particular time, yes, you know, the pop music of a particular time is the most popular, is listened by most people in that time, but, you know, the most hugely popular music, often then, 20, 30 years later, nobody's heard of people producing it. It's an interesting fact that apparently Justin Bieber's income is bigger than that of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra. I thought that was quite interesting. But, now Justin Bieber, that's an interesting case. So he's obviously not, he's got some staying power. So that probably means, you know, in 50 years, interesting question. You know, 50 years, will people have heard of Justin Bieber? Probably. In 100 years, not so sure. But they'll have heard of the Berlin Philharmonic. We assume that German culture is going to keep going, and that there will be a Berlin Philharmonic for quite a while. Okay, and my last point is about something called the Acquaintance Principle, which is a very important principle in aesthetics. There aren't very many principles in philosophy, and I think we're trying to work out what are the principles worth recognising. And in aesthetics, this is very important, but we need to understand, you know, I'm not sure if it's properly understood, I'm sure it's not properly understood. The Acquaintance Principle says, I must see or hear the work to know that it is beautiful. It says that aesthetic judgments, unlike moral or ordinary cognitive judgments, must be based on first-hand experience of their objects and are not generally transmissible from one person to another. But it seems that without having experienced artwork X for myself, I can base the aesthetic judgment X is beautiful on the fact that it's passed the test of time. Now, I don't think that's right, actually. I don't think that's an aesthetic judgment. I mean, I can know that something's passed the test of time, but I can't make an aesthetic judgment about it until I've seen it. But it's true, you know, I like going to the National Gallery. Maybe I like going to national galleries in general because I know, look, it's bound to be the top quality stuff there, you know. So I don't have to worry about, am I wasting my time? There isn't, you know, one's life, as you get older, you realise there isn't that much time. So you want to see as much art as possible, and you don't want to waste your time on stuff that's a bit dodgy. So if I go to the National Gallery, I'm pretty guaranteed it's all pretty good quality stuff, you know, except the stuff in the basement. But some that's a bit dodgy. And likewise, you know, you may laugh, but I do actually rely on Rotten Tomatoes, on their ratings, which are remarkably accurate. So if I want to know whether to see a film in the Tyneside cinema, I look it up on Rotten Tomatoes, and I only go if it's above 90%, or maybe 88% on special occasions. And now they somehow calculate this on the basis of, they have a reasonable assessment of who the good critics are, you know, probably just based on reputable publications like, is it in the Times, is it in, you know, Time Out or something like that, and they like it, and so. But it's remarkably accurate, you know, I've rarely gone to a film above 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it hasn't been any good. I mean, that has never happened, I think. You know, so that's very curious, that is. There's something good about that algorithm. But, you know, I mean, that's a way of making sure you don't waste your time seeing garbage. I mean, obviously you will miss some things the critics, they got it wrong, you know, they didn't realise. So it's a rather safe conservative policy, arguably, because I'm going on what the critics are saying, and I'm missing a few good things that they're not picking up, but I'm not wasting my time on, because I got fed up with, I did see a few, you know, there was a time when I used to see, go to cinema, it's a terrible film, before Rotten Tomatoes appeared, and I thought, I'm really infuriated that I'm wasting money seeing that, and then you're not sure whether you should leave, because it might get better, but it doesn't, you know. So, but I can't rely for the test of time or the Rotten Tomatoes test. That's not my aesthetic judgment. What they're saying is you're likely to be rewarded. We can't guarantee that. You know, you go and see this film or see this painting, and you may not like it, but you probably will. Now, there's all sorts of dangers here. And actually, one thing I'd say about criticism is there are two things that are wrong, two attitudes that are wrong. One of them is, I never read the critics, I only rely on my own judgment. And the second thing is, I always rely on the critics, I never try and form my own judgment. Now, obviously, no one's going to say the second thing, but they quite often say the first thing, and that's wrong. and this is something that Hegel apparently said something a bit like this. In aesthetics as in ethics, we judge for ourselves but not by ourselves. So the great mistake is to think that if you don't judge by yourself, you're not judging for yourself. But you can judge for yourself but not by yourself. In fact, you should not judge by yourself. You should take account of what critics say and then form your own judgment. Now that may be a very difficult thing to do. But no one's suggesting it's an easy thing to do, form your own judgment. And I think what I'd like to do is, so you just go straight on the questions. Do you mind if I... Go on. I record this, because, I might have said that. It's being recorded anyway, but if I just record it, so it doesn't matter. If I just record it on my laptop, but anyway, yeah. Okay.
Yes, so now we'll have the Q&A. And one thing is that we don't do follow-up questions usually, so you'll have to wait until there are no more questions to ask your follow-up question. Yeah, whoever has the first question.
Go ahead.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned about sort of how the ideological critique, how that is probably wrong because the things that become extremely popular in culture aren't necessarily the things that back a specific ideology. And that made me think of, the movie American Psycho, right? With Christian Bale. That's sort of a good example of that, how that became extremely popular, even though it was basically making fun of and satirizing the main yuppie kind of culture of the time, right? Do you think things like that are also kind of constrained by the time that they're made and become less compelling as times change, or do you think countercultural stuff can often withstand, that some things no longer popular? So does the popular thing need to exist for the countercultural things to be compelling too?
So what you're asking is, on my account, isn't counterculture dated as well?
Yeah.
And therefore doesn't pass, because something that's dated won't pass the test of time. So it's a kind of paradox that, well, not a paradox really, but it's something that is really of its time, very much of its time. And you might say, well, that's a good thing. Jane Austen really conveys what it's like in Regency England. It's really got a flavour of that time, and surely that's a good thing. But if it's too much, if that's all it's about, if it's only about contingent features of its time, which may make it which is why people love pop music, because it's so located in its time. And then they constantly refer back to the music that they loved when they were in their teens, and early 20s and so on. And that's the music they really identify with, and you constantly find this on YouTube comments and so on. And, well, there's something, yes, that is music that is the opposite of what I'm saying passes the test of time, because it's very much, there's art that is very much of its time, and then there's art that passes the test of time. And they're unlikely to be the same. Now, if the it depends what kind of countercultural critique you're talking about. I mean, Hendrix would be probably an example of countercultural music, I suppose. That seems to me will pass the test of time. So it depends on the kind of critique. There can be countercultural critique that's quite dated, or very that doesn't. It's hard to say. You can't generalise, right? But I think I don't think counterculture has to be very much of its time in that way that means it won't pass the test of time. But obviously some of it will be, yeah.
Questions, Taylor.
Yeah, so I kind of have a question, I think, about this place thing with cultures. So if a place and that cultural history of the place has a canon, that's fine. And I think one of the critiques then is that there's certain people then that exist in that place but don't feel they identify culturally with the history of the canon, and therefore that place or its institutions has some kind of a duty to look to other canons and incorporate it to ensure that everyone inhabiting that place in the current time feels like connected to what they're learning or what they get to be experienced to. And do you think that has to be part of like a canon, or do you think every place can have its own?
Well, let me give an example now. You might say, well, the way I've been talking, the test of time and place means that we talk about whether Western classical music appeals over centuries, but also does it appeal in Southeast Asia and Japan and South America or something, you know. And, well, yes, that's part of the test of time applying to classical music. But, I'm not sure this is what you mean, but those places have their own culture and they should have their own canon. And world music, you know, the advent of world music, for all that it can be criticised, and you know, it's a commercial category, world music. But you know, there is a canon of Jamaican reggae, you know, that people who like classical music ought to get to know. You know, so it works both ways. I'm not suggesting that this is all from the West. I mean, perhaps I'm inclined to put it that way. Because of the way the literature works, because of where I come from and so on, but no, it works both ways. Any place which appreciates music X, that is not from that culture, likewise, it should be contributing its own music to X, you know, for them to appreciate. And increasingly that happens. I mean, that is happening. So that's what I mean by saying that the canon, it's not the concept of the canon that's wrong, it's the way the canon has been composed, well, historically, you know. So, people like Adorno, very insightful on music, had no interest in non-Western music. Well, that's a pity. I mean, to say that it's a pity, I don't know how you'd say it. I mean, unfortunately, it's a kind of Philistinism, because, you know, how narrow-minded that they didn't appreciate music that was from a very narrow background. That's a criticism of them. I mean, that, you know, they're musically insightful. I say it's a particular pity because this man had a lot of interesting things to say about music, was very insightful, but not in that way. And it's a pity that he wasn't, because he would have, his views would have been more, you know, broader and, more humane if they had been.
Luke?
What's the role of technology in the scope and development and content of the canon?
The role of technology?
Yeah. Like what you were saying about why did music not have a canon? I was thinking, was it to do with notational issues or I don't know.
Well,
What you mean?
Well, it is a pity for all those audiences deprived of these great composers for so long that there wasn't a canon. But why wasn't there a canon? Well, it's perhaps partly because music was not highly rated as an art form. Music was the least valued of the arts until the 19th century, when it suddenly took off and became the most valued. But, you know, it's something to do with being not highly valued. It's also to do with all sorts of things about copyright. There was no copyright, so it was very difficult to make a living as a composer, as somebody who produced works. And a work being something that is portable, that can be heard in different contexts. You can't make a living from that if there's no copyright. And so all sorts of technological considerations were involved in whether a canon could develop. And the canon, on the one hand, the term canon is a modern term. Its old use is in the connection with the Bible, with a collection of inspired religious work. books. I would say I think there's a broad and narrow sense probably of canon. So that, you know, there's a literary canon going back to Homer, and the Iliad and the Odyssey have always been in the canon. Well, you know, they entered the canon at some point, and then they've remained there ever since. So that's a very ancient canon. But in the case of music, music's been different. I mean, you know, there isn't. I mean, the earliest you could start talking about musical works would be the Middle Ages. So you get musical works formed, you know, Periton and, you know, people like that. So music's just a latecomer among the arts. I suppose that's, you know, that's part of the answer to that. But also, yes, technology, social conditions are very relevant to why the canon would evolve and, in the way I just described. So, you know, copyright, for example. No law of copyright. In the 19th century, Dickens campaigned to get a law of copyright because, you know, without that, people were ripping him off in the United States. You know, they were just publishing his stuff and he wasn't making any money from it. You need copyright to have artists making a living. Yeah.
Eric?
So I've got a question about these three senses of the canon, because I'm slightly worried that we may have conflated different senses of the canon at different points, because we've distinguished the three types of canon, and then we've moved to just using the word canon broadly, potentially understandably because there's going to be a lot of overlap. But the thought is that the aestheticist view is maybe going to not do quite so well on a view where we're looking at the disciplinary canon, and the ideological critique is maybe going to have a bit more weight to it, because it seems that we're looking at these two types of value, kind of ethical value versus an aesthetic value, and the ideological critique's coming in and saying we've got a moral obligation to include different things in the canon, and the aestheticists saying no, we should include things in the canon because they're good and they've got aesthetic value. When we're talking about what works we teach, and which ones we are sort of endorsing and propagating, is the aestheticist maybe going to struggle a bit here?
Well, I don't agree. I mean, if you think about PhD subjects in English literature compared to philosophy, there's a tendency to do obscure figures that no one's done. So you think, oh, no one's done a PhD on Joe Schmo or Josephine Schmo. Oh, that's a good reason for doing it. That, in philosophy, that would be a reason not to do it. You know, because why has nobody done a PhD on this? Because they're not very interesting. Probably. I mean, it may not be, but it probably is. So there's a different, and I would want to bring those together. I mean, not that I don't think there may be, you know, there's a place for that kind of scholarly research, but in philosophy it tends to be more that you do the major figures. You know, nobody should say, oh, yet another PhD on Hume. You know, that's just ridiculous. There's no end of PhDs you can have on Hume because he's such a rewarding and rich kind of thinker. So I wouldn't have a divergence between a disciplinary and a performing or critical canon. I think they should be close together because the things that are rewarding for audiences should be the things that are studied. So that would be one major difference, I think, between those two notions of canon. So I wouldn't sharply separate them. But I mean, one point about the disciplinary canon, you see, Bach was always in the disciplinary canon. If you were studying keyboard music, you would study Bach. He just wasn't performed, partly because they weren't concerts. You know, concerts are a modern phenomenon after late 18th century. So Bach was just the writer. No, he wasn't. He was before the beginning of that. So he was part of what is taught. If you're studying music, then you study Bach, but you don't go to concerts. There's no Bach concerts. So there's a difference there, and obviously that's an unfortunate difference. You know.
Yeah.
this might be a sort of misunderstanding, but I was just going to ask. So if we sort of see pieces of art, as you said, but not self-perpetuating, but then they set the standards for good things, like Shakespeare is good. We understand really good piece of drama in a sort of term of shape, comparatively to other good bits of drama. So if they're setting those standards, and then if we say really good, canon-worthy pieces are reflective of some way of a wider society, and they're products of a wider society, so they still have some, deeper inherent values, like in Shakespeare, Henry VIII doesn't beat up children because that's sort of generally the values they'd say no, so they're reflective of their values. How then do you escape the idea that the canon has these standards which are set in place by traditional views, and then it reinforces following those traditional views?
Oh, that's a very good point. What's the relation of tradition to the canon? So so you're saying the objection to the canon is that it reinforces traditional views. That's the idea it's conservative, right? And it reinforces traditional views because Shakespeare is traditional. Well, I need to have an analysis of tradition, which I am working on, and again, that's another fundamental topic discussed in sociology, maybe, anthropology, but not philosophy. It should be. It's really important. So Alistair McIntyre talks about it a bit, but he doesn't really analyse it. And I think what I get from McIntyre, though, is that if a jazz musician talks about playing in a tradition, they don't mean, right, well, some of the time I play quite thoughtfully and reflectively, and then other times I play in the tradition, which means I play, completely, in a completely unthinking, following the past kind of method. That's not at all what they mean. Playing in the tradition means respecting a valued canon of artistic production. And at different times, if they're an avant-garde player, they want to create their own kind of style or something, but at other times they get sustenance from styles that already existed earlier and develop them in different ways. And so, in the tradition doesn't mean unthinking, conservative. It means exploring the work of the past in a resourceful way. So I think there's a dichotomy in the notion of the tradition. So, or there's a kind of unthinking. There's a sense in which tradition is unthinking. Why are we doing this? Or because you've always done it like this. That's the way the conservative thinks. It's not crazy. It's not a completely crazy response. But it's certainly not what a jazz musician means when they say playing in the tradition. They don't mean doing it the way it's always been done. They mean exploring this rich resource that some people might be a bit impatient with because they want to do something new. But actually, you can do something new by exploring traditions. But I need to say quite a bit more about what tradition is. But there's an immense amount to be said about that. Actually, there's an article by Armstrong, the metaphysician. I can't remember his first name at the moment. Somebody knows his first name. David Armstrong. Known to his friends as Armo, because everyone in Australia has a nickname like that. Right? So he wrote an article on tradition, quite surprising, and very insightful article. It's one of the best articles on tradition. But there isn't much written on it in philosophy. So there should be.
We have time for one or two more questions. So, Roberto.
Yeah, so kind of goes off what Eric was saying, but...
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, so it kind of starts off with what Eric was saying, but different canons are formed in different ways, right? Like the jazz repertoire canon is kind of, with the real book being illegally passed around, and then kind of maybe like an opera repertoire was much more institutionally based, and like a folk canon was based much more on just, word of mouth and people passing it along each other. So you'll have different canons where I'm kind of inclined to say in some canons it's much harder to pass the test of time because there are so many more people involved in the creation of that canon, whereas something like an operatic kind of institutionally constructed type of canon might be more, if you know somebody, or if you happen to be somebody who a lot of people at a certain very important school really like,
you're much more likely to stay there, versus somewhere where a lot of artists are kind of spreading word of mouth, it's kind of created much more loosely. So I'm starting to think, like, do you think one of these canons is a more pure canon, or a canon that is said to be, you know, more accurately reflective of passing the test of time? Do you think one of these canons, you know, has less ways to be critiqued than the other one? You know, do you have a certain way you think a canon should be constructed? If there are so many ways they're constructed, that's kind of...
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
I can appreciate that the canon of Jamaican reggae is constructed in a different way to the canon of Western opera, because the canon of Western opera is a very high, well, it's a high art, you know, and it's well supported. I mean, it's a very expensive art form to produce. It needs to be a lot of money to support it in all sorts of ways, whereas reggae, no, that doesn't have that kind of support. It doesn't need that kind of support. Now, things are changing a bit. So there might be quite a few academics working on reggae, nothing like as many as working on opera. I'm sure that's true, and I don't suppose it'll ever be. And maybe it shouldn't be. But you're still rather wedded to this picture that the canon is imposed ideologically. And I don't think that's the case. I mean, I give the example of Tchaikovsky, right? So, you know, the Communist Party doesn't think that he's a bourgeois composer. There's no way that Tchaikovsky was in any way sympathetic to Marxism, or even I never heard of Marx. I don't know. I'm not sure very much. You know, but the Russian people loved Tchaikovsky, so they had to bow down in the end to what the Russian people wanted, which was Tchaikovsky, and who wrote operas among other things. So it can't be imposed. I mean, you can try. That's an example of trying to impose. They tried to impose, what did they try? I'm not sure who. There were all sorts of hack composers they would try and impose. But people didn't want them, they wanted their Tchaikovsky. So in the end, you have to, so that's how the canon works. It's not an imposition. It can't be, you know, whether something passes the test of time depends partly on what larger audiences, how audiences react to it, you know. You can't make them react in a certain way. And, you know, you would think if anywhere could do that, Stalin's Russia could do it, but they couldn't do it. So, I assume it can't be done.
Okay, we'll do one last very quick one in the back.
So some works of art seem to be appreciated currently because they're so bad they are good. But that seems to be extremely...
Because they're so bad, they're good.
Yeah.
Well, what have you got in mind?
For example, the movie The Room. That's an example of something so pathetically bad that it cannot help it.
The movie The Room.
Yeah.
It doesn't, I haven't seen it because it hasn't got 90%.
But it seems to be extremely rooted in how the contemporary canon shapes expectations and how these things subvert them.
Well, I'm not sure there's a contemporary canon for the reasons I gave.
By that I mean the canon.
Contemporary
which has-
taste, yes.
Yeah, but which is formed by the canon.
Well, maybe I shouldn't, maybe that's not what I've got to be careful here. I mean, I don't think it's, somebody could say, yeah, sure, there's a contemporary canon. It's what people are listening to and going to and seeing and something. So what's the difference between the canon in my sense and that? And it's not, the canon is not just what people like. The canon is what people respect, you know, and in the end, what they respect survives what they like, and what they like just drops away, unless it coincides with what they respect or admire, shall we say. So that's the difference. So that's why you can't talk about a contemporary canon meaning what people like. It's because people know that, look, this is trash. I'm being entertained by this, but it's not very good. Will it last? Probably not, quite rightly, you know. So somebody can like something but not admire it. They can be entertained by it and not admire it. So that's the difference. That's That's why you shouldn't really talk about a canon is an evaluation. If something enters a canon, it's because it's good. Whereas what you're describing is something that is just, well, it's good as entertainment. Now but it's not, so if something enters the canon because it's good as art, not just as entertainment. And what you're describing, a contemporary canon, is just what's good as entertainment. So that's an important point. That's an important reason why it's a mistake to think about the canon being contemporary canon as just what people are going to hear and see, I guess.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you very much again, Professor Hamilton, and thank you all for coming out
Well, thanks for inviting me.
on a Monday night. And so our next talk will be after reading